Hi, thanks, Susan. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I think I'd like to start this off and be a little bit provocative. Both Representative Frank and Bob talked about this idea, sort of framed in terms of guns versus butter debate, what we're spending on the military versus what we could be spending at home. Though that may be true, and I think that it very much is true, I think that it is a political frame that does not necessarily sell as best it could on Capitol Hill or throughout the country, more importantly, because it's good and well to talk about those ideas in a group of, sort of seeding liberals in Washington, D.C., but when you're trying to make an argument to the country, I think that the guns versus butter debate sort of falls on deaf ears. And this is why. Because Americans like the idea of being strong. They like the idea that the best military in the world, that we have it and that we can, kick anybody's butt and that sort of thing. And when you start talking about trading military spending off for health care, I think that it causes people to sort of scratch their heads a little bit. I'm going to propose maybe a different message and a different frame that I think is probably more effective when you're talking with a wider country, that includes a lot of conservatives and has the possibility to bring them along. Because let's face it, progressives have a historic opportunity. We've been haunted by the ghosts of 1968 when the party really split over Vietnam, and we were tagged with this idea of being very weak on defense. Now we're at a point, the polls show, there's a Democracy Pro poll that came out both during the campaign and one that's was just published a few weeks ago, that's talked about how Obama has gone leaps and bounds in terms of erasing this mantra of weak on defense Democrats, weak on defense progressives. This is something that we can capitalize on as long as we sell these ideas to the country in the right way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here. I'll mention a few numbers very briefly, though I think people have done that very well up to this point, and then offer a few tangible suggestions about policy ideas we can maybe think about to push this debate a little bit. So I think that the best frame to look at this through is the fact that America needs a strong military. It needs an effective military. It needs the strongest national defense on the planet. The issue is that we need to spend effectively to have an appropriate defense based on the threats that are out there and the missions that we perceive our military to have. Now, that means the military spending, can go up if we perceive a military threat and we have to defend ourselves against it, or, as is the current climate, we're in 2009, and threats are vastly different than we faced before. This is not the Cold War anymore. And so, it's almost tough to blame a lot of the flag officers at the Pentagon, because most of them came of age during the Cold War when they were brought up against this, with this idea that we had one big, gigantic threat out there called the Soviet Union. And to take that level of corporate knowledge and transfer it into 2009 in a post-September environment when this has been the bread and butter for the better part of 30 or 40 years in most cases, and realize that here we are today, 2009, and we've faced Al-Qaeda and disease and climate change and nuclear proliferation and terrorism and all the rest of it, it's like turning an aircraft carrier, for lack of a better metaphor. But that's where we are. And I think that Bob Gates, as we've seen through some of the quotes here, has done a great job of starting that conversation. We're not there yet. We have to keep moving. And I think that as a progressive community, it's our job to really engage in that debate and keep moving, to use a cliche, push the ball forward. But that's extraordinarily important, and that's really our role in this. Just to do a few numbers, we talked about military spending, including Iraq and Afghanistan for the first time, which is at $664 billion. Which includes about $130 billion for Iraq and Afghanistan. That's up 4% overall in terms of baseline dollars and 1% overall if you include Iraq and Afghanistan. We've increased military spending by 76% since 2000. That's pretty impressive. And to give you just another point of comparison, the EU's military budget for all of our European partners is $313 billion. China, whose official statistics vary widely, spends anywhere from $75 billion and increase about 15% a year, and have been doing so. They could be spending anywhere really between $75 billion and $150 billion. If we, as the United States, did not spend another dime on defense from now to the next 25 years, we would still have a greater conventional and nuclear military capacity than the Chinese. So I think that we're at a point where there's a very central tension that we have to discuss. We talked about cutting all these weapon systems, whether it's the F-22 or the PDG-1000 destroyer or missile defense or whatever it is, yet we still increase military spending. How is that? And why is that? What can we do about it? I'll read you a brief quote from a GAO study and congressional testimony from earlier this year. So according to a GAO study, cost of the fiscal year 2007 portfolio of major defense acquisition systems increased 26%, and development costs increased 40% from first estimates. That's the first bid that the contractor put in, both of which were higher than the corresponding increases in DoD's fiscal year 2000 portfolio. So what does that mean? Also, sorry, just back up. There's now a 21-month average delay in delivering weapon systems capabilities, which is a 5-month overall increase. Weapons are costing more than the original bids, and they're taking more time to produce. The second aspect, which is one that never gets discussed, particularly in progressive circles, which is really, I think, shocking, is the cost of personnel. How much do we spend now on weapons? Because we can go about cutting tons of weapon systems. But we also have to have a discussion about how much money we spend on people in the military. That number has increased also at an alarming rate because we've had 2 major military deployments. I think the figure in 2000 was about $75,000 average expenditure per soldier, sailor, marine, and airman. That's gone up to about $135,000 per troop. With Barack Obama's campaign pledge to increase the end strength of the military by 92,000 people, that increases the military spending over the long term. Now, this is an interesting tension about the whole thing. We're spending, if you start including things like benefits, healthcare, training, and housing, we're spending something like $195 billion on personnel out of that $664 billion budget. That's more than every weapon system we buy and the $80 million we spend to research and development. The total for weapons procurement and R&D is about $190 billion. So this is a politically very tricky issue because how are you supposed to be a weak on defense Democrat who's supposed to shake this mantle and cut military costs without looking like you're hurting the troops? We've had a GI Bill, and we've had military benefit spending, we have Walter Reed and all that. You have to be able to care for the troops and keep spending money. So this is a really important issue. I don't have a very good answer at all. But we've got to talk about it if we want to have an honest discussion about how much money we spend on the military. So I just want to talk about finally sort of 3 ideas we can have to really shape this debate. One is to sort of move the discussion. How else are we going to start talking about this? And I really think it's this idea of appropriateness on military spending. How much do we spend? It's not a fight with conservatives of, this dollar, we spent 1% more this year versus last year. Who cares? Really, who cares about that? It's making sure we have a whole-of-government approach that spends money appropriately to face the fights that we're in now and anticipate those in the future. Conservatives are very susceptible now to charges of being reckless on security. This is very important. Poll numbers show that this term recklessness, when it gets tied around the conservatives' neck, is something that's really hits home with voters. So spending money on weapon systems we don't use, like the F-22 that has never flown a single mission in Iraq or Afghanistan, is something that they're susceptible to. When you spend money on those systems, it weakens the country. Otherwise, every 4 years, here's one more idea. Every 4 years, we have this quadrennial security review where the Pentagon does a big review of what the threats are and what we face and how we're supposed to deal with them. We need a national security review. One that takes a step back. We have a pie chart about the military versus all of government agencies. We need to take this step back and say, what other agencies are involved in national security? Are they the State Department, the FBI, Intelligence Services, Economic Services, USAID, all of it, and coordinate it in a whole-of-government approach that really advances what we're trying to do and make national security more productive enterprise, efficient enterprise, and more effective. And 2 other things, real quick. We have to increase the amount. This seems very wonky, but it's actually true. We have to increase the amount of amount of staff that are on the Office of Secretary of Defense, because the way it happens now is the individual services compile their wish list budgets, and then they come in and they say, hey, we want everything, every dollar that we can possibly imagine. And the Secretary of Defense simply doesn't have the accounting staff to go through those budgets line by line and say, hey, maybe you don't need this, maybe you don't need that. If we bring the Office of the Secretary of Defense in early to work with the services and staff them up appropriately, then you're going to see better cuts and higher levels of efficiency. And last, this weapons reform bill of McCain-Levin has been good. It started the conversation about how we buy weapons and what reforms we can do, but it's really been watered down. So be very careful when you hear about what a great bill it is, because there still remain loopholes where members of Congress can come in and say, oh, well, this weapon system is over time on the budget, but we really need it for national security. It's probably more in the vein of economic interests in one's own district. So hopefully that, that may have provoked some discussion, and I thank you very much for your time.